Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. I have Dr. Kipp Davis. He's a specialist on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He is a Hebrew Bible scholar. I say that. I know that other academics, we've talked about this, that the oldest living fragments that we have any evidence of comes from where your field of specialty is. So I think you have a leg up when it comes to investigating Hebrew Bible. And we'll be doing another episode where we're going to discuss the invention of Moses together and my controversial documentary recently with our friend Neil. But before we do, there's so much to talk about. You're going on Danny Jones' podcast tomorrow, day after tomorrow?
Day after tomorrow.
I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes. More exposure.
I'm excited about it, yeah.
So what would you want to talk about?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I'm actually going on the Danny Jones podcast to talk mostly about the Dead Sea Scrolls and this fascinating figure in the history of the discovery and the publication of the scrolls by the name of John Marco Allegro. He wrote this sensational book that completely ruined his career called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and it's nonsense, but you know, he's an amazing figure. The modern discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls itself is an interesting story. It's a neat story. It's a political story. It's got piles of important modern religious overtones, and I think it's one of these things that I get excited about sharing with people and helping them understand. But I think one of the reasons why I dropped into Danny Jones's radar in the first place was because of some of my interactions with the owner of the channel Lady Babylon, Dr. Ammon Hillman, and some of his very controversial ideas with regards to the relationship between the Hebrew Bible and the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible known as the Septuagint.
So, you just said something. You repeated yourself, Kipp.
Yes.
Why would you repeat translation? Let's back up real quick, just briefly to say, I was invited by Neil to join this discussion, which I thought was going to be a discussion. Yeah. I did not know that it was going to be a shit show. And it turned into a shit show, and I was honestly a little bit upset by how that turned out because I did not expect it to go south like that. I thought there would be maybe a little friction of like discussion, but I didn't know it was going to be this kind of poo-poo show on you. And so you
and me both,
Ammon, me and Neil start talking, and I'm like, man, that did not go well. So Ammon's position was that the Hebrew Bible, for those who don't know, was constructed after the Greek Bible already existed. Yes. And that's what you mean.
So he's a well-trained classicist. He spent his entire career dealing with these really arcane medical texts. He loves reading Galen. And he's taken all of that and kind of transposed that knowledge and his readings of this rather specialized collection of Greek literature onto the Greek text of the Bible known as the Septuagint, which was written in Koine Greek, which is, some people call it gutter Greek, rather crassly. It's like lay level colloquial Greek is what Koine is. It wasn't the language of the philosophers and the historians. It wasn't what Plato and Aristotle or Herodotus and Plutarch were writing in.
Right.
Wasn't even what Josephus was writing in. This was common lay level, ordinary Greek that more people would be able to engage with and understand. And I think that's an important point to make, because I believe when it comes to reading these texts, if you're not using the proper vernacular in your translation or your reading, you're going to come away with wrong messages about them. So, I mean, you think about the difference between, I guess, reading a short story written by a young woman who, maybe just lives out in the poor part of an urban environment compared to a highly technical medical document.
Right. So your first complaint, as far as, and I don't mean it complaint in some bad way, but like the first red flags to you are using other literature that may actually be divorced from the genre, the location, yes, the culture, who knows, that actually trying to find a word. And this is something we're going to probably have to cover, specifically dealing with the naked young boy that he gets into. For those who don't know, this might have to be partially bleeped because it's so controversial what he says on YouTube. According to Ammon, Jesus was a drug addict, pretty much overdosing in a garden with a naked young boy that he is trafficking. And he, as he's overdosing, needs to extract his juice, to put it like, I'm trying to be very cautious here, in order to get out of the overdose, but does not succeed, gets arrested in the process of trying to accomplish this, and ends up on a cross overdosing, and he overdoses before he suffers to death.
And he's executed for child trafficking.
So he's So wow.
Yeah.
Wild. Pretty wild. So it's back to Hebrew Bible, though.
So yes.
We'll come to you. Don't worry. We will. But he's using kind of this, I found a text over here that is in this particular thing like you're describing, and then finding a word that might be used there and may have a specific use in the context there, and applies that definition outside of it into these other areas of literature.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there a couple of good examples of this are his interpretation and translation of a verb like chrio, from which we get the noun Christos, which we translated into Christ, into English. This is a translation of a Hebrew word. The verbal form is mashach, which means to anoint. The noun form, the nominal form, is Mashiach, which means anointed one. It's the Messiah. Within early Jewish tradition, kings and priests were anointed, Mashach, meaning that they had oil poured over top of their head. This was part of the ritual, the commissioning into leadership, or into just into leadership.
Right.
So that's where the term came from. It developed in the Second Temple period, in the Hellenistic period, into this idea of a deliverer who was going to come and save Israel from the oppressive, first the Persians, then the Greeks, then eventually the Romans. So that's kind of the context for this. The Greek translation, the translators of the Hebrew text into Greek were Jewish. They chose this Greek word, chrio, which means to rub on or to medicate in some sense. Usually, though, it's on the skin. Mm-hmm. It's a sensible word as a direct translation of this Hebrew word, which means to anoint, pouring the oil over top of yourself, right? But this Greek word used in particular medical contexts has to do with the application of like very strong drugs, narcotics, hallucinogenics, these sorts of things. But within the New Testament, you can't just take that directly and apply that to every instance where this word is already constructed within a context out of the Semitic languages. So that's one example of how he makes this mistake. Another example is in and this is something we can get into a little bit more as we talk through some of this stuff. But I've heard Ammon say that the divine name Yahweh is actually a Bacchic cry as part of this this very ancient Greek religious ritual, and that this is this is where the word comes from. Well, not really. They sound very similar. The Bacchic cry is ehwa. The Hebrew word is it's either Yahweh or Yehovah or even Yahol. There are various ways of pronouncing it. There are various ways in which it's written, depending on how old the texts are that you're investigating. But the people who wrote these texts understood the Hebrew name of God, Yahweh, to mean something different. They always attached it to the verbal root of what grammarians will call the copulative verb, this very technical term, which is the word to be that we have in English. In Hebrew, it's haya, and it's got this very nebulous, sort of esoteric sense then of the name of God, Yahweh, being attached to some semblance of ultimate being, right. Or I prefer to think of it as his presence and activity in right. comparison and contrast to other Canaanite deities. So you can see how by misconstruing the meanings of these words to mean something entirely different, you can create some pretty fantastic pictures, fanciful pictures of what's actually happening within the text of the Hebrew Bible. But it's importantly stuff that's just not there, because you're not reading the literary, cultural, historical context of these pieces of literature correctly.
If I may, and I'm glad we're talking about this, because this goes down a rabbit trail that avoids us having to deal with a naked young boy and young man. I mean, let's get very specific here.
Very important, though.
Yeah, it is important, especially when we're trying to understand it as is without. Yeah. But this is something that I find interesting. You've heard me do videos. In fact, you've private messaged me your critiques, and I appreciate that. Parallelomania or this and that, right? And I definitely think that there may have been some of this going on in some of the documentaries I've produced in the past, where I've conflated some of the works of multiple scholars who definitely would not agree with the conclusion of maybe stuff that's drawn based on my observations. For example, Bruce Loudon and Philip Vajenbaum, they might have an overlap on seeing Greek parallels, but one is seeing them back here in the ancient 7th, 8th century. The other one is thinking Hellenistic, and one is thinking genetic, and others thinking more common. Someone's communicating, whether it's a common source, whatever. Yeah. This is getting off the rails a little to kind of point up about Yahweh. So a lot of the historians that are writing about these similarities between Dionysus and Jewish religion are seeing parallels that are leading up to the 1st century. And they comment about this. The Jews are really doing the same thing as this. And most scholars draw and go, maybe they're just seeing similarities and then they're drawing some type of syncretism. They're trying to find common ground, and maybe they're doing a little bit of what Herodotus does. Well, they call Astarte this, and there may be that.
We're still doing this. Why would we think they're doing anything different, right?
Well, here's the interesting thing. I came across Nisam Amzalog's work dealing with metallurgy, right? And he wants to see, was Yahweh worshipped in the Aegean?
Right.
But notice how he phrases it out the gate. He deflates the whole Greek supremacist kind of concept that Greek is the oldest and Greek is where everything comes from. And I think there's a bit of guilt on my part, unknowingly, that there's a history of this. I did not realize where Greek comes from a Europeanish background, Proto-Indo-European, and then like these poor Semitic, ignorant, you see what I'm saying? Like there's this. I didn't even realize that. I just thought it was so interesting that there's not as much paid attention to as potential overlaps between Greeks and the Bible, right? Yeah. Greek literature, Greek myth, Greek stories. Well, Amzalog's pretty much takes me on this journey when he's trying to say Yahweh may be metallurgical. He's making a case to try and say that he thinks the Kenite hypothesis might be the case. Meaning, for those who don't know, we're talking about this region in northwest Arabia, like in the desert area where they're mining tin and copper and all this stuff. So he thinks there's this origin from a metallurgical root, right? And that's disputed amongst academics as is. But what I find interesting—
it's a good theory.
It's interesting that how he explains how Yahweh would be if he was granting that there's parallels between Dionysus and Yahweh. He thinks this, and I thought this was fascinating. He doesn't say, well, Yahweh's just a ripoff of Dionysus. He thinks that a merging takes place where Yahweh, in a form, travels west. So one of the Homeric hymns of Dionysus describes the men who capture him, the pirates. One of the earliest stories of Dionysus, they capture him. And they want to find the family of Dionysus because they want money. Hey, we have him as a ransom. So what do? It says that they traveled east in the region of Israel. Right. They're hunting his family down in the east. Why is that? And Amzalog says even there's clues in Greek mythology that Dionysus is not original to the region. He comes from the east. Well, if you grant this speculation, then what if, I mean, this is fun. I love entertaining stuff like this, even if we find out it's wrong in the future. What if Yahweh, because he's an ancient God, somehow gets carried during the Sea People situation and all that, and ends up through trade, whatever, travels in a form.
In the Aegean.
Yeah, he's not saying the Greeks had it first.
Kind of interesting the way you put that. Even within the Hebrew text, Yahweh is a God that is not native to Israel.
Right.
Like if you look at maybe a couple of the oldest texts that we have within the Hebrew Bible, in the Song of Devorah, in Judges chapter 5, it talks about Yahweh coming out of Edom or Seir.
Right.
The Song of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32 echoes much the same thing about Yahweh coming out of the desert lands and into. So I don't know. Is there something about this God being a God from the outside?
Yeah.
That's entering into a new culture. Is this part of the trope? It's
a bit speculative, but it's interesting speculation that isn't insane. It's not, over the top. And what he also quoted was this interesting passage somewhere in the Dionysian myth where Dionysus comes from the east in the south, and it says that he came from the sea that bears no life. Like he's in the Dead Sea region is where he comes from. Bro, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, well, he isn't originally Greek. This is evident that if anything, which would make sense if you thought about it, let's suppose we found an ancient story of Dionysus being torn apart. Osiris was torn apart. That myth goes for a long time, and many have noticed parallels between Osiris and Dionysus being ripped to pieces, participating in their burial and resurrection in a way, or their rebirth. Like, I am speculating, and I admit that, but it still doesn't give the Greek came first. They borrowed. Deucalion, the flood myth, comes from Mesopotamian mythology. They did not borrow. You see what I'm trying to say? Sure. So we have to nip that because I think some of that is teaching a broader audience on YouTube this notion that everything came from Greek, and Greek is
this form of Greek supremacy, of Philohellenism and this is an old 19th century idea.
Right.
That's been long discredited within scholarship, but this is the kind of feeling that Ammon Hillman seems to be playing on. Right. That the entire world is Greek, and that you can just read Greek, or you can read Greek out of all of these religious texts from the period. Hence, the Bible was originally written in Greek,
right,
and then translated into Hebrew, which is obviously incorrect and demonstrably incorrect.
Give us a few examples.
So, we can talk about this on a couple different levels. Where I usually like to start is in my sandbox, which is the manuscripts. So when we're talking about manuscripts of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, what do we have? We've got a lot of manuscripts from, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, manuscripts that were preserved by predominantly Christians. Once you start to get into earlier periods, stuff before the 2nd century, stuff before the Common Era, into the 1st or the 2nd century BCE, the findings become really slim. We have maybe a handful of tiny little scraps of pieces of Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible. One of the really exciting things that was discovered in the Judean desert when the scrolls at Qumran were discovered, as well as at other sites like Nachal Hever or Matzadah. There are actually a small handful of Greek fragments of Bible. It's pretty exciting. But I need to emphasize that, there's just a tiny little bit of a material here. There's not a lot.
Right.
So let's compare that to what we have for Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible from before, the 2nd century CE into the 1st century BCE, 2nd century BCE. We've got a collection in the Dead Sea Scrolls of literally hundreds of manuscripts, probably thousands of fragments.
Right.
And not just fragments of what's commonly called the Masoretic text, which is the received unpointed text that has been transmitted into the versions and the editions that our English Bibles are translated from. So not just those. We actually have competing versions of the Bible written in Hebrew. We have Hebrew texts which closely resemble the often wildly different Septuagint version of the Bible, but written in Hebrew.
Ooh.
We have copies of the Samaritan Pentateuch, which was a version of the text that was preserved by the Samaritan communities living in the northern part of the region. We have those preserved at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and interestingly, without what scholars will identify as the Samaritan polemical, theological insertions into the text.
Wow.
Right? So this illustrates that this was a text that was already, by the mid-Hellenistic period, it was by the 2nd century BCE at the latest. This is a text that was already being distributed in Hebrew in a variety of competing editions. Another thing that we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a collection of manuscripts known as the reworked Pentateuch. And this is, in my opinion, an incredibly interesting and important collection of manuscripts, because I believe these are probably the first examples of an attempt to build a Torah, a collection of the books of Moses. And we date these, we have manuscripts of these that date to the middle of the 2nd century. I think you can date the composition of that to, the 3rd century BCE. So just in terms of the manuscripts that we have, there's an enormous amount of variety in Hebrew, and there's just enormous numbers in Hebrew when compared to the Greek.
And just for those who have heard us repeat, me and Neil, we love to repeat Elephantine and Yehud.
Yes.
This Aramaic is closely resembling or even relatable to Hebrew language in many ways.
Yes, absolutely.
So here you have older, clear manuscripts that are in a family-related linguistic. You see what I'm trying to get at? Like if we found in Yehud or like in ancient Babylonia, for those who don't know, Babylon, there was a community of Jews we call Yehud or Yehuda. They had Aramaic writings. We have evidence of them. We have Elephantine evidence. These are Jews. And what are they writing in? Greek? No, they're writing in Aramaic. They're writing in a family-related type of linguistic to Hebrew. And I just think that's important as we're leading up. It is very important.
And that brings us into another important point when it comes to the manuscripts. Let's talk about Aramaic texts, because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have piles and piles of Aramaic texts. A number of them are direct translations of the Hebrew into Aramaic. So we have Hebrew manuscripts in varieties of versions. We have a small collection of tiny fragments of Greek translations from the Hebrew, and we have Aramaic translations from the Hebrew. We also have, and this is something I think that's important to point out that often gets missed in this discussion, is let's talk a little bit about this model of the Greek text being original and then the Hebrew Bible being translated I'll give you another example beyond the infinitive absolute of just something that's happening within the Septuagint text, which I think shows pretty clearly and dramatically that it's a translation of the Hebrew. And this takes place in one of the very famous stories in the Bible, and that's the revelation of Yahweh's name to Moses on the top of Mount Sinai. We all know this scene from movies like The Ten Commandments starring Charlton Heston, or the more recent one with what was his name? Shoot, now
The famous Pharaoh Kings or whatever it is.
Yeah, gods and kings or something in Exodus. Yeah. So, anyways, this is a story I think everyone knows. Moses is tending his flocks in the land of Midian, and he sees on top of the mountain, Mount Sinai, a bush that is on fire but is not burning up, and he comes to check it out, and it's actually Yahweh who's come to talk to him, to deliver a message to him about how he needs Moses to go and deliver his people out of Egypt and bring them back to this mountain so that they can offer sacrifices to him. So Moses needs a vouchsafe, a guarantee, in order to demonstrate to the people that he knows what he's talking about. So what he says to God is, when I come to the sons of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Ehya Asher Ehya. He continued, so shall you say to the Israelites, Ehya has sent me to you. And God further said to Moses, this shall you speak to the Israelites, the sons of Israel. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This shall be my name for all time. This is my appellation for all eternity. Now, that Hebrew phrase, Ehya Asher Ehya, means something like, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. Now, what's happening here is the Hebrew writer is making a play on the name Yahweh. We don't know where the name Yahweh comes from, nor what it means.
Could be a folk etymology in a way?
It's a folk etymology, exactly. So the Hebrew writer has the same questions about the name Yahweh that we do. And so he invents this story to explain what the name Yahweh means, because it sounds a lot like this expression, Ehya, which means I will be, or I am. So, hence, the folk etymology. Yahweh is a play on this verb, haya, meaning to be. So I know what you're thinking. How does the Septuagint handle this text? Well, I have to pull it up here because I wasn't.
That is going to be curious to see what happens.
So let's take a look and see what the Septuagint has to say here. And now I'm going to read this from the New English translation of the Septuagint. And Moses said to God, look, I shall come to the sons of Israel, and I shall say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. They will ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am the one who is. And he said, so you shall say to the sons of Israel, the one who is has sent me to you. And God again said to Moses, so you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is an everlasting name of mine, and a memorial of generations to generations. So you see what the Septuagint translator is doing there? He's just translating directly the Hebrew. You remember the Hebrew was Ehya, Asher, Ehya, and it is that way because God's name is Yahweh, which sounds a little bit like Ehya.
Yeah.
So the Septuagint translator is just translating this directly. Tell him, I am has sent me to you, which is a direct translation of the Hebrew. But then later on, when he identifies him, he says, the Lord, the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, has sent me to you. So a common feature within the Septuagint text is to translate the divine name Yahweh with just the Greek word Kyrios, which means the Lord.
Right.
So that's what he's doing here. And when he's doing this, if you read this, you're not going to make that connection, right? If you imagine yourself a Greek reader reading this text and God says to Moses, I am has sent me to you. And then he says, my name for all time is actually the Lord. How do you make this connection?
Yeah.
In Greek, it's ego eimi, I am the one. And then the word which we translate into Lord is Kyrios. So there's no, you can see there's no etymological connection to make there. There's no phonetic connection to make there. So how does again, if this is a text that was originally written in Greek, why does he offer this explanation for the name of Yahweh? And how does the Hebrew translator then take that and cobble it into this story where the play on words actually works?
Right. Yeah. You have to so much more work in your mind to assume the other way. Yeah. I get what
Yeah,
you're saying.
exactly. It's just so much more simple.
Yeah.
It's just much simpler.
I guess this is going to boil down to a final statement about that issue is this. It was like almost like my process of coming out of being a staunch mythicist,
Mm.
from being a staunch fundamentalist to being someone who isn't sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I lean, but I have my confidence levels a little higher on there was a guy.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So this idea, right? You'll notice in some of the psychology of people, and I cannot read people's minds, but you'll notice in psychology that I've had people message me, and I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but there's people who've said like almost like if there was a guy, it almost makes them think they have to go back to church or something, or they have to then believe making a
Yeah,
point. Then
right?
it's like, what's the psychology behind needing it to be Greek first? It doesn't bother me. If Greek was first, cool. If it's Hebrew, it's no skin off my back.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother me. If there wasn't a guy, someone asked me the other night when I went on to a Brazil live stream. Well, if we found archaeological evidence that we found him, we found Moses,
Yeah.
like in the 12th century, what would that do for you? And I said, it would be awesome to have found the guy. Does that mean he split the sea? Does that mean this guy turned rods into actual serpents? Does that mean no? And so it doesn't change my ontology all of a sudden or make the story more believable. It means there was a guy. And so I'm just using that as like
Yeah.
an analogy.
Honestly, and I think I can deliver this message to people who get anxious about that kind of thing.
Right.
If anything, I think discovering these historical roots at, the very base of the biblical text, if anything, I think it only further reinforces just how human these books
Got it.
are.
Got it.
Within again, just thinking about something that I've been dealing with on a regular basis now more recently, uh, a lot of apologists spend a lot of time and energy doing their best trying to show that the Exodus and the conquest are things that actually happened. And when you go through the hoops that they have to jump through in order to make a plausible case
Right.
for an Exodus and a conquest, by that point, they've watered it down so much
The magic's gone.
that the magic is gone. And in my opinion, that does destruction to what's happening in the actual text. I said this recently. There's going to be some stuff coming out recently with our mutual friend Stephen Woodford of Rationality Rules. I made this point recently on a show with him. Guys,
the story of the Exodus and the conquest is a miracle story.
Right.
The whole point is the supernatural intervention of Yahweh, which inserted the people into the land and obliterated all their much stronger, much more powerful enemies. That's a feature of the story.
Yep.
And if you're watering that down to, oh, you know, there were some incursions here, and the settlements were actually really tiny, and some of them weren't even fortified at all, and they didn't actually kill people, they just made them go away. Like, at this point, why? Like, how does this story even have any meaning anymore?
Yeah, you're just trying to make it more realistic. And so you can play in that sandbox. And if you do, again, like you said, it becomes like, well, was Goliath really 9 foot this? Oh, no. He was a
only
6 man.
6'2".
Oh, okay, cool. So he's just a dude, and it wasn't really that insane of a fight, really. I mean, yeah, he might have been bigger, but it's not so miraculous.
So this isn't, and at that point, it's not even a great story.
Yeah.
I mean, oh boy, David killed a 6 foot tall man.
You know what? You know what's a great story? Gilgamesh being 16 feet tall and 9 feet wide.
It's an amazing people in antiquity, that's why they wrote this stuff, because these are fantastic stories.
Right.
That don't have any chance of having any sort of semblance of reality.
That's, if people wanted to get you and me, oh, you just don't want to believe. Like, dude, I love these stories.
Yeah.
You know, I put on the believing mind when I immerse myself into the story to enjoy the narrative. So in a way, I understand, but they're trying to historicize this stuff so much that I think that the original authors themselves, if they were trying to pull the wool over your head, they did a damn good job, and they'd smirk and chuckle at it, or they'd go, "You have completely ruined what I was trying to do."
Yeah.
You completely ruined it. Did you look at Herodotus and read about the miracles that happened between the Persians and the Greeks and read it that way? Oh, you're not taking the time to do all that? Then why are you doing that with mine?
Yeah,
Because we have miracle stories too. And they have miracle stories, and these people have miracles. It's fascinating what's happening.
It really is. It really is.
Yeah. Thank you.